Constructed in accordance with the 1930 London Naval Treaty, which placed restrictions on the tonnage of cruisers, destroyers, and submarines for the United States, Great Britain, and Japan, she was the flagship of her class. On March 14, 1934, Mogami slipped down the lines at Kure Navy Yard, one of 4 ships built in the class. Mogami's career in the Imperial Japanese Navy would be long but unsuccessful. Similar to her sisters, the Mogami had the capacity to break the waves at 35 knots, displaced 134 to 40 tons, and carried 12 long-lance torpedoes and 10 8-inch cannons. She was a powerful weapon of war with a large superstructure that loosely resembled a battleship. For her 850-man crew, she was also a popular assignment. Mogami and her sisters had air conditioning, steel tube bunks for the seamen instead of hammocks, drinking fountains with cold water scattered around the ship, and larger refrigeration areas for food, which meant better chow. A thorough investigation revealed that a crew that ate pickles every day was more productive than one that didn't. Therefore, Mogami, like many Japanese ships, had multiple pickle lockers located throughout the ship. Future ship classes did not include air conditioners, since they were noisy. As Cruiser Division 7, Crew Div 7, the 4 ships of the class, Mogami, Mikuma, Kumano, and Suzuya, were assigned together. The bad luck started immediately. Mogami was damaged by a typhoon in late 1935, and because of shoddy welding, her bow crumpled during her initial deployment. The crew discovered that they were unable to train her turrets due to the extreme warping of the hull. The ship was ordered to disarm and dry dock for extensive reconstruction by an investigation board. Although Mogami was already known for being an unfortunate ship, she flew Rear Admiral Shigenoshi Inoue's flag during the attack on Malaya and Borneo when war broke out. During these assaults, her 8-inch cannons covered landings. She and Mikuma were covering the Japanese landing at Bantam Bay in Java during the Sunda Strait combat, which was her next trip. Troops were being unloaded from about 50 Japanese transports of varying sizes. Upon encountering these targets, the Australian light cruiser HMAS Perth and the American heavy cruiser USS Houston, which were escaping Java through the strait, charged and threw shells. Mogami and Mikuma hurried to the area, joined by the light cruiser Natori and 10 destroyers, when the Japanese transports and the destroyer Fubuki, which was their close escort, begged for assistance. Mogami launched a 6-torpedo volley at the Allied ships, sinking 5 of the targets with multiple strikes. Regretfully, these were the Navy minesweeper WW2, the Japanese Army transport Sakura Maru, Tatsuno Maru, and Horai Maru, and the Japanese Army landing ship Ryujo Maru. The commander of the 16th Army, Lieutenant General Hitsohi Imamura, was also thrown in the drink without any ceremony. After 20 minutes of clinging to a piece of driftwood, a passing boat pulled him up. Overloaded with heavy equipment, that ship leaned further and threw the general and its equipment into the sea with a dreadful sound. The general landed wet and sat on a pile of bamboo, while his assistant limped over to him and congratulated him on his successful landing. In order to apologize to Imamura on behalf of the Imperial Navy for the event, Commander Shukichi Toshikawa, who oversaw the 5th Destroyer Flotilla, went to Imamura's Chief of Staff. In fear, the Chief of Staff replied, "Don't tell General Imamura. He believes it was committed by the American cruiser Houston, but Houston had no torpedoes, so let her take the credit." Nevertheless, Mogami and other Japanese cruisers quickly surrounded Houston and Perth, and they were hit by a tremendous volley of shells and torpedoes. Houston held out until 12:33 a.m. on March 1st, when Seaman William F. Stafford, stationed atop the sloped fantail, blew the bugle for "Abandon ship." Perth went down 5 minutes after midnight, go the same day. 12 minutes later, with her battle colors still flying, the Ghost of the Sunda Strait sank. It's interesting to note that one of Houston's pre-war captains, Jesse Oldendorf, sank the Mogami Tormentor in order to exact revenge for the 1944 destruction of his former command in Surigao Strait. Following that, Mogami joined the cruiser force of Rear Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa who had been sent to assist Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo in his expedition into the Indian Ocean in April 1942. Nagumo sank 2 cruisers and a British carrier while bringing 5 carriers into combat. Mogami participated in the sinking of the 15-15-ton Hermod and the 44-34-ton Dagfred, 2 Norwegian cargo ships, on April 6th. Both ships were sunk, but all of their crews survived. Mogami was then assigned to the Battle of Midway with Crew Div 7, which was commanded by Rear Admiral Takeo Kurita. Before the planned Japanese invasion, Crew Div 7 was tasked with conducting a nocturnal bombardment on the American-held atoll. The bombardment mission was ordered for the following evening, despite the killing of the Japanese carrier group on June 4th. When Kurita's ships were roughly 90 miles from Midway, sanity won out and they were recalled. At 2:15 a.m. on June 5th, a lookout aboard Kumano sighted the USS Tambor, a surface submarine just off her starboard bow, as the cruisers steaming homeward at 28 knots in the faint moonlight, flanked by the destroyers Asashio and Arashio. Mogami was last in line as Kurita made a 45-degree maneuver to port on all of his ships. Lieutenant CMDR Masaki Yamauchi, her navigator, pushed his officer of the deck aside and performed the difficult maneuver single-handedly. He turned, thinking he could see Mikuma just ahead of him, too far away. After making a slight course correction to starboard, he became aware that he was staring at Suzuya rather than Mikuma. Mikuma was right in front of Mogami, between the 2 cruisers. "Port the helm! Hard a port! Full astern!" yelled Yamauchi. But it was already too late. Mogami's bow was crushed from the captain's cabin forward and bent to port as it sliced into Mikuma's port side, aft of the bridge. The fuel tank of Mikuma burst, causing an oil spill. 40 feet of Mogami's bow were crumpled in. The cruiser's damage control officer, Lieutenant CMDR Masayushi Saruwatari, rushed forward to locate the 4-station crew, completely confused and unsure of what to do. The Imperial Japanese Navy placed more emphasis on combat training than damage control protocols. Saruwatari moved swiftly, giving his troops instructions to repair the holes and clean the compartment adjacent to the damaged one. To the annoyance of Captain Arika Soji, the skipper, he ordered all flammables and explosives, including depth charges and torpedoes, to be tossed overboard. Kurita took stock after the damage control crew was done. Mikuma was leaking oil, and Mogami could only go 12 knots. Kurita was eager for the main fleet to meet up with him. He quickly continued through the night with Kumano and Suzuya after separating Mikuma and both destroyers to escort the battered Mogami. Lieutenant CMDR John W. Murphy, the astute captain of the Tambor, sent a message to his chain of command, which culminated with Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, who was in charge of the American fleet off Midway. Since his son, Edward D. Spruance, was a lieutenant on Tambor, Spruance took a keen personal interest in the communications. Midway also received the word, and the commanders of the atoll sent out a dozen Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers and a number of patrol planes to find the enemy. Sighted 2 battleships bearing 264, distance 125 miles, course 168, speed 15. A patrol plane reported at 6:30 a.m., ships with damage and oil flowing. Under the command of Captain Marshall Tyler, Midway launched an assault with a squadron of 12 Marine Vought SB-2U Vindicator dive bombers. On the way down, Japanese flak put Captain Robert Fleming's Vindicator on fire, and they failed to strike any hits. After dropping his bomb, his blazing plane crashed into the Mikuma's after turret, causing the plane to explode. Captain Soji of Mogami, whose ship sustained splinters from close calls, responded, "Very brave. The crew was killed, and the ship's speed was decreased after the crash dive ignited a fire aboard Mikuma that spread down the starboard engine room's intake." 8 B-17s, led by Lieutenant Cole Brooke Allen, then launched an assault on the unfortunate cruisers, killing 2 soldiers on Mogami in one close miss. Spruance considered the different reports on the flag bridge of the aircraft carrier Enterprise. According to one of them, there was great game because the 2 cruisers were 2 fierce battleships and a carrier. The carriers Enterprise and Hornet sent 57 dive bombers accompanied by 20 fighters to strike the Japanese force, but Spruance was unable to position itself for an attack until June 6th. Although their targets were actually 12,000-ton cruisers, the American pilots reported them as 31,000-ton battleships. They were thrilled to discover that the ships were hardly moving and were not putting up much of a fight. When the dive bombers descended and dropped bombs on Mikuma and Mogami, the radio frequencies in America became blue with the ecstatic chatter of aviators. "That's awesome, boy. Oh boy, oh boy." One pilot radioed, "You son of a gun, you're going up. I wish I had a camera along." The Americans focused extensively on Mikuma because they thought it was a battleship, killing Captain Shikao Sakayama, the skipper. Bombs also fell on Mogami, punching out her number 5 turret, crippling the torpedo tubes and igniting fires below decks. The biggest damage occurred in Sarawatari when a bomb pierced the seaplane deck and ignited a fierce fire, destroying the sickbay, which was occupied by patients, physicians, and medics. Because Sarawatari was unable to contain the fire, he ordered the damaged compartment to be sealed off, trapping the soldiers within and ultimately killing them. Sarawatari witnessed harakiri committed by an engineering sub-lieutenant. "I shuddered with immense grief," Sarawatari subsequently remarked. The devastation and bombings had a profound effect on Mikuma. Commander Hideo Takashima, the executive officer, gave the order for his crew to leave the ship. Mogami helped the 2 destroyers rescue 300 soldiers from the wrecked cruiser despite her injuries. However, they were unable to remove 100 to 150 seamen from the water due to the fierce American onslaught. Lieutenant Masao Koyama, a Mikuma sailor, pulled out his samurai sword and killed himself on the forward turret. According to historian Gordon W. Prange, he became a folk hero in Japan. By so aiding the U.S. Japanese naval commanders who show promise will be eliminated. A horrifying image of destroyed ships coated in smoke and wreckage, as well as defenseless sailors in the water attempting to escape drowning in oily puddles, was left behind by the American attackers. When Spruance dispatched Lieutenant J.G. Edwin Kruger on a dive bomber with Mr. A.D. Brick of Fox Movietone News, who was prepared to film the devastation, the scene was preserved for future generations. Lieutenant J.G. Cleo Dobson, who was upset over the significant casualties his carrier's air wing had suffered in the conflict, joined them. Dobson intended to do the same to the Japanese in retaliation for their strafing of American sailors who had been shipwrecked. However, Dobson discovered that roughly 400 to 500 sailors were in the water, all around the ship, when he got to the battleground. Boy sure would hate to be in the shoes of those fellows in the water. Dobson subsequently wrote in his diary, "I was chicken-hearted and couldn't make myself open up on them after flying over those poor devils in the water. Since I might find myself in their position in the future, I shouldn't feel so terrible for them. When I'm sitting by the fireplace and lack the motivation to go out and perform again, I'll appreciate reading this." Spruance was annoyed by the resulting photos, which were among the most memorable of the war, because he could see that he had deployed a huge force to finish off 2 battered heavy cruisers rather than 2 battleships and a carrier. However, Mogami stumbled away after 800 holes and the loss of 90 men killed and 101 wounded, while Mikuma fell soon after sunset. Sarawatari's damage control was crucial to Mogami's survival. If he hadn't discarded the torpedoes and sealed off important compartments, the cruiser most likely would have sunk. Mogami set sail for safety and struck in the Caroline Islands, battered and burned. After undergoing 5 weeks of repairs, Mogami was deemed seaworthy and sent to Japan's Sasebo Navy Yard. The cruiser missed the entire Guadalcanal campaign because it was in dockyard hands from August 1942 until April 1943. Kumano and Suzuya, her sisters, were tasked with escorting the remaining aircraft carriers. As Japan looked for ways to compensate for the aircraft carriers lost at Midway, Mogami underwent a significant overhaul while in the dry dock. Mogami's aircraft deck stretched all the way to the stern, and her 2 aft turrets, one of which was lost at Midway, were taken out. She received improved air search radar and additional anti-aircraft weapons. She was now able to transport 11 seaplanes, which might be used as fighters or reconnaissance aircraft. The seaplanes' gasoline tanks and bomb stowage spaces were the armored barbettes beneath the turret rings. Mogami returned to work in May 1943, getting ready to set sail for the Aleutian Islands in anticipation of the anticipated American landing on Attu. Her misfortune persisted. On May 22nd, she struck the oiler Toa Maru. On June 8th, Mogami was also at Hashirajima Bay when the powerful battleship Mutsu was sunk due to a magazine explosion in her No. 3 turret. Mogami searched for survivors using boats but was unable to locate any. Because the Americans did not invade the Aleutians in April, Mogami was able to ferry Army troops to Rabaul in July thanks to her flight deck. On November 5, 1943, aircraft from the American carrier Saratoga stormed the harbor while she was back in Rabaul. A fierce fire was started when one of Saratoga's dive bombers dropped a 500-pound bomb between Mogami's two forward turrets. The damage control crew had to submerge the cruiser's bow by flooding both magazines. There were about 19 crew members murdered. After a month of urgent repairs, Mogami left for Truk. She acquired additional anti-aircraft weapons for a total of 38 when she was shipped to Corps Navy Yard for complete repairs. From December 1943 to February 17, 1944, she was at Kure Dockyard. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Mogami escorted the Japanese carrier force but had no significant impact on the conflict. She only had 5 seaplanes because of material limitations. Following the catastrophe in the Philippine Sea, Mogami was deployed to the front lines at Linga Roads, near the oil reserves in neighboring Borneo, under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. Mogami was part of Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's 3rd Section, which was tasked with forming the southern jaw of a nautical pincer strike against the American invasion force off the island of Leyte on October 20, 1944, when the Americans invaded the Philippines. In order to entice the American carriers away, the remaining carriers were to demonstrate off the Philippines as part of the intricate Japanese plot known as Sho Ichi Go, or Victory 1, with one task force going through the San Bernardino Strait and the other under Nishimura via the Surigao Strait. The battleships would crash into the undefended American transports off the coast of Leyte. 2 old battleships, the Fuso and Yamashiro, carrying his flag, Mogami, and 4 destroyers made up Nishimura's task force. Another squadron, led by Rear Admiral Kiyohide Shima, and consisting of 2 heavy cruisers and 1 light cruiser, would follow after Nishimura's force to support it. There was no coordination among the task forces. From Singapore, Kurita brought his battleships to Brunei, where they divided into their 2 divisions and refueled. On October 22nd, Nishimura's ships went for action from Brunei Bay, but they were hit by airstrikes from the USS Enterprise, the modern carrier USS Lexington, and Mogami's old foe from Midway. The American airstrikes warned the Americans of Nishimura's approach, but they did not stop the Japanese advance. Rear Admiral Oldendorf used the limited terrain of the Surigao Strait to channel the Japanese cruisers and deploy his ships in a wide gauntlet to resist the attack. They would encounter PT boats first, followed by destroyers, and then a maximum of 6 battleships, including 4 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 5 survivors of Pearl Harbor. The conflict may have contained some personal considerations for Oldendorf. His former command had been sunk by Mogami. In the warm years of peace, he had been the captain of the USS Houston, where he had taken President Franklin D. Roosevelt on fleet inspections. Oldendorf's strategy was straightforward. I had the old-time gambler's theory: never give a sucker a chance. I will definitely not give my opponent an even break if he is stupid enough to attack me with less force. Shortly after midnight on October 25, 1944, Nishimura's unit launched into the Surigao Strait. PT boats saw them right away and harassed the Japanese, reporting their whereabouts. The Japanese threw shells at the closest pursuit while attempting to light their hounds with searchlights. The brawl strained Japanese nerves, but neither team scored any hits. Because of the declining visibility, Nishimura feared that Mogami would mistake him for the enemy. Fuso lookouts did indeed spot a suspicious silhouette off the port bow at 1:05 a.m. They described the silhouette as American because they were trained to identify enemy ships, but not Japanese ones. When the battleship fired 6-inch rounds in that direction, the voice radio said angrily, "Cease firing! Cease firing! Ships that are friendly." It was Mogami. Unfortunately, 3 men who were laying in sickbay after being injured in the morning's American air raid were killed when another 6-inch shell struck the continuously ill-starred ship, just as the message was being relayed. Following Nishimura's command for his ships to stop firing, the whole Japanese formation reorganized and started moving north, with Mogami trailing behind the battleships. Nishimura maneuvered his ships into battle position for the sprint up the Surigao Strait at 2:11 in the morning. The Americans launched an attack at 2:58 a.m., with destroyers losing 27 torpedoes to the Japanese on the advance. Devastating was the American torpedo barrage. 2 destroyers and Fuso were destroyed by the torpedoes, and a 3rd destroyer was wounded. Nishimura, on Yamashiro with Mogami in tow, continued to dodge American torpedoes while Fuso moved away from the combat line and sank. When Nishimura's troops struck the American front line at 3:53 a.m., Oldendorf's heavy weapons had a tremendous impact. Together with the roar of the American cruisers' 8-inch and 6-inch guns, the American dreadnoughts' 16-inch and 14-inch rounds blazed through the night and pounded the Japanese ships. The American onslaught appeared on Mogami as far-off flashes, like the successive lights in a dark room, turning on like rows of a switchboard. The whistle and hiss of incoming shells followed the light show. Massive walls of white water were blasted up by those shells that missed. Mogami was able to reveal her torpedo tubes after the majority of the American shells exploded on Yamashiro. The cruiser was not disregarded by the Americans. Under the light of Yamashiro's guns, destroyers saw Mogami advancing on the approaching Hutchins. Mogami was hit by fire from the destroyers Dali and Botch. In the confusion, Captain Ryo Toma of the cruiser wondered if he was steaming toward American or Japanese ships. Indeed, he flashed a red Very star and 2 enormous searchlights. His signals were met with a barrage of shells from the Americans. The steel framework of Mogami started to sag after she sustained damage to her mainmast. Her 2 radio rooms and anti-aircraft installations were devastated by other shells. Toma made the decision to turn around and attempt to launch torpedoes from his port side. However, Oldendorf's cruisers launched a barrage of 6-inch and 8-inch rounds in response to the fire and smoke, which made Mogami's suffering worse. After the engine room's air intake caused smoke to enter the engine room, causing the crew to leave, hits were made on the deck near the starboard and on the number 3 turret, rendering it inoperable. When the main illumination failed, emergency lights turned on and produced a drab orange hue. Toma and his officers debated whether to continue the attack or to retreat on Mogami's bridge. His officers thought they could still fight their way past the Americans, but Toma wanted to pull out. Their Bushido spirit won out over Toma. At 4 in the morning, Mogami turned around and went north. Nearly everyone at both positions, including Toma, his executive officer Uroko Hashimoto, navigator Nobuyuki Nakano, torpedo officer Konji Uehara, and 4 other important officers, were killed when 2 shells from the cruiser Portland destroyed Mogami's compass bridge at 4:02 a.m., and a 3rd shell ripped into the Air Defense Center. When lookout Akiyoshi Nishikawa stumbled to his feet, he discovered that his friend Yoshida was missing a foot, and that the majority of the 16 soldiers surrounding him were dead. Just 4 signalmen, who just so happened to be on the signaling platform, survived. With no one in charge, Mogami was steaming along uncontrollably. The lead was taken by the chief signalman, Chief Petty Officer First Class Shuichi Yamamoto. He discovered that the steering mechanism's power had failed when he dashed onto the destroyed bridge. Using the sound-powered phone, he dialed the armored wheelhouse 2 decks below, requesting manual steering and someone to locate the senior ranking officer. Yamamoto, in the meantime, ordered the gutted cruiser to retire after realizing he had to make the decisions for the time being. As large rounds crashed into the cruiser's forward engine room, sending high-pressure steam exploding in all directions and killing trapped engineers. Mogami, shuddering from repeated strikes, swung out of line. Black smoke streamed out, smothering people as the flames moved to the boiler room at number 9. The furnace is turned off by boiler tenders. All lights in the port after engine room were extinguished at 4:03 by another shell. In a matter of minutes, Mogami had lost 3 engine rooms. To give Mogami engine power, the engineers in the port forward engine room disregarded heat and smoke. The gunnery officer, Lieutenant CMDR Gichiro Arai, was informed he was in command as the trembling cruiser rattled away. He was unable to report to the bridge, however, because the ship's weapons were firing. The Khan would have to stay with Yamamoto. Yamashiro and Admiral Nishimura were sunk by American guns and torpedoes as Mogami withdrew from the battle, ending the final dreadnought fight in history. The Americans lost only 39 men to death, 34 of whom were aboard the destroyer Albert W. Grant, which was struck by friendly fire, while the Japanese had failed to score a hit. Japan lost 2 battleships and 3 destroyers at the Battle of Surigao Strait, one of the most lopsided naval wins in history. Meanwhile, Mogami was attempting to stay alive. The only remaining ships of Nishimura's fleet were her and the destroyer Shigure, and both were retreating. The crippled cruiser and destroyer sailed south, and at 4:15, their lookouts were shocked to see a destroyer racing toward them at 30 knots. Shigure took an 8-inch shell in her fantail, and her skipper recorded that he decided to retire. It was the Shiranuhi, Shima's flagship. The second round of the conflict began when Shima's flagship, the cruiser Nachi, arrived behind her. Through smoke screens, Shima's ships moved forward. On the ocean, oil fires raged. The ships went past the crippled and defenseless destroyer Asagumo. At 4:15 a.m., radar then detected 2 encounters far ahead. "All ships attack," Shima ordered, assuming it was the enemy. 2 of Shima's 4 ships rushed forward, unleashed their long lance torpedoes, which had wreaked havoc during the arduous battles for Guadalcanal, and uncovered their torpedo batteries. The torpedoes needed to run 8 miles. The cruiser Louisville, Oldendorf's flagship, turned out to be their objective. The torpedoes, however, missed. Shima and his men looked into the smoke and mist to see what was happening, and then Mogami emerged from the smoke, her flight deck aft, her number 3 gun turret a ruin, the gun barrels blackened, the forecastle full of holes, and the flames burning. Finally, the scolded Mogami was retiring, with Chief Petty Officer Yamamoto still on the bridge. As the 2 ships neared the range, crew members on Nachi yelled encouraging banzais. Captain Enpei Kanuka assumed that Mogami was dead in the sea and decided to pass him a bit too near on Nachi's bridge. To the astonishment of all, however, Mogami was in fact chugging along, just barely, and headed straight toward Nachi. Kanuka said, "Complete reversal, and use the right rudder to stay clear of Nachi's sister. It's too late." There was a sickening, jarring crunch as Nachi's anchor deck and Mogami's starboard at number 1 turret met at 4:23. The impact destroyed Nachi's number 2 anti-aircraft mount, tore a 15-meter hole in Nachi's port bow at the waterline, and further dented Mogami's already beaten hide. Alarms for flooding sounded, and the 2 vessels separated. Yamamoto shouted with a megaphone on Mogami's bridge, "This is Mogami! XO and the captain were dead. In charge gunnery officer. The steering was ruined. Engine-driven steering. Apologies." Exasperated, Shima and Kanuka took the responsibility. At 5 knots, Nachi started to plod south. Mogami found it difficult to follow her 2 sisters in line. No sound came from the 16 torpedoes that were fired, but everyone listened for explosions. The irate destroyer skippers complied with Shima's order to reverse course to the south and rejoin at 4:35 outside American range. Shima was evaluating the situation on Nachi. Despite the damage from the crash, his flagship was still capable of 18 knots. However, as the battered Mogami demonstrated, it was evident that tragedy had already taken hold. Shima conferred with his officers. "Admiral, the enemy must be waiting for us with open arms up ahead," observed Kokichi Mori, a torpedo officer, to Shima. The force of Nishimura is nearly destroyed. We will undoubtedly get caught in a trap. We could pass away at any time. Shima understood that it would be unwise to proceed at this time. It's time to leave. Shima gave the command for his ships to pursue Nachi at 4:41. They were retreating slowly, hobbling along at 20 knots. Ammunition began to cook off on the damaged Mogami, posing a risk to the crew and impeding repairs. Firefighters were forced to use portable pumps and water buckets, since the fire pumps were not working due to damaged engine rooms and steam pipes. 4 of the torpedoes that Arai had ordered his troops to drop exploded, adding to the already simmering fires. The Black Gang could no longer withstand the heat in the only working engine room, where temperatures were reaching 140 degrees Fahrenheit. After starting the main engine, the crew left. Amazingly, the engines continued to run, and Arai maneuvered his ship using hand steering. The destroyer Asagumo was sunk by the cautious American pursuit. 8 miles west of Esconchada Point, where Nachi and Mogami had collided an hour earlier, the Louisville was at 5:20 a.m. Oldendorf instructed his column to turn right and be ready to shell the escaping Japanese with full broadsides after examining the scenario via his binoculars. Toward 5:29, the open fire gong sounded, and the Americans continued to fire shells toward Mogami, causing multiple direct hits. Mogami was burning like a city block, according to Oldendorf, but the cruiser withstood this most recent barrage, accelerating to 14 knots. After more run-ins with PT boats, Shima's exhausted fleet was now leaving the Surigao Strait and entering the Mindanao Sea. PT 491 launched its torpedoes and charged Mogami first. When Mogami fired back with 8-inch shells, PT 491 backed off. Shima's nerves were strained as more PT boats appeared from his flanks and bombarded him with torpedoes. Bamboo poles were identified as American submarine periscopes by edgy lookouts. The only thing Shima's withdrawing ships could be sure of in the morning was an American airstrike. When Shima radioed for fighter cover, the escort carrier USS Santee launched 9 Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and 4 Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters, while the USS Sangamon launched 2 Avengers and 6 Hellcats at 5:45 a.m. They attacked Shima's shattered ships, misreporting them as 2 battleships. Because Japanese heavy cruisers had enormous superstructures and seemed to aircraft like battleships, that frequently occurred. The Americans launched an assault. On the destroyer, Shiranuhi, strafing killed 9 and injured 25, while the unfortunate Mogami was hit by another torpedo. The smoldering Mogami was then stormed by 10 Avengers and 5 Grumman FM-2 Wildcats from the USS Manila Bay, which scored 2 more hits, ignited fires, and brought the ship to a stop. The cruiser was doused with water by the destroyer Akabono. The ladder and hatch were blazing hot when the guys left Mogami's No. 2 engine room. The fires were fought by everyone, save the anti-aircraft crews. The cruiser's oil tanks caught fire after the American bombs crashed into them. Arai, the acting commanding officer and gunnery officer, ordered the 3 forward 8-inch magazines to be flooded in order to avert an explosion. But the valves for the No. 1 gun chamber would not open due to the warped bulkheads. The cruiser was on fire and might capsize at any time. At 10:30 a.m., a tearful Arai gave the order for his soldiers to leave the ship. Since Mogami was unable to utilize her cutter due to broken davits, Akibano closed her port quarter so that the cruiser's crew could board. After 3 hours of frantic firefighting, the weary crew of Mogami managed to get topside on weather decks and evacuate the ship, scurrying onto Akabono. The cruiser started to sink at 12:56 when Akabono fired a long lance into Mogami's port side. An explosion in No. 1 magazine accelerated her downfall. Mogami fell under the waves at 1:07, while her crew watched and wept on Akabono. Despite losing her skipper and senior officers, the cruiser had fought valiantly in her last engagement, surviving 3 bomb strikes, a collision, more than 100 shells of various calibers, and the explosion of its own torpedoes. Akabono rescued all 850 members of Mogami's crew, with the exception of 20 officers, 171 enlisted men, and 1 civilian. Nachi's steaming to Manila lasted a bit longer. On October 29th, she was subjected to an American airstrike while traveling, which caused minor harm but increased her suffering and humiliation. Nachi was pushed into dock number 103 in Manila so that her damaged plates could be fixed and her flooding bow drained. By November 2nd, that was achieved. Task Force 38, led by Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, bombarded Manila with 4 waves of airstrikes on November 5th. Nachi began after the second wave, with her fleet commander, Rear Admiral Shima, ashore for a briefing. However, at 12:50 p.m., she was trapped between Manila and Corregidor, and rendered immobile by torpedoes and bomb hits in the starboard boiler rooms. From the beach, a distraught Shima watched as American bombers destroyed his flagship. Although Akabano ran to the aid of the sick cruiser, the cruiser was damaged by 5 aerial torpedoes as the 4th wave ensnared both ships. At 2:45 p.m., Nachi sank, carrying 74 members of the 5th Fleet personnel and her captain, Captain Kanuka, together with 807 men to the bottom of Manila Bay. Only 220 guys made it through the sinking and subsequent strafing. 23 sailors and 1 commander were killed when Akabano was carried to safety ashore after being struck by 2 bombs and set on fire. However, the United States was quite interested in Nachi's wreck, Navy. The submarine rescue ship USS Chanticleer, commanded by Lieutenant Luther Leroy Tyndall, a 39-year-old former Navy boatsman, anchored close to the disaster in March 1945 following the recapture of Manila Bay. Since Nachi had served as a flagship, she was most likely a significant intelligence source. Chanticleer scouted the hulk for intelligence during daily dives on the wreck from April 14th to May 7th, 1945. Joseph Sidney Carnegie, the top diver for Chanticleer, descended first and landed on the cruiser's mast. As he approached the bridge, he saw an anti-aircraft gun tub completely occupied by Japanese skeletons. Astonished but unfazed, Carnegie made her way to the bridge and discovered paperwork in drawers and on shelves, as well as stacks of charts arranged on the chart table. Chanticleer was instructed by the Office of Naval Intelligence to retrieve all relevant information from the Nachi. With 20 mailbags full with sodden paper, the divers discovered an abundance. Shima's flag plot was included in their tidy selection of Nachi's chart house. Divers were able to create a methodical search strategy after discovering a comprehensive set of Nachi's blueprints. One dive only succeeded because the divers followed the path made by a 1,000-pound bomb that penetrated 4 decks down, demonstrating the importance of the blueprints. There were a few mistakes. Tyndall was determined to bring the safe up once Carnegie found it. Carnegie, who had worked as a coal miner, opened the safe using a plastic explosive charge. Upon doing so, they discovered that the safe held no classified documents, only packets of Japanese currency, totaling up to 2 million yen in coins and banknotes, which the 5th Fleet used to pay its employees. Friends could get 10 yen notes as mementos from Chanticleer crewmen. Divers joked that the Japanese Navy had locked up the rice bowls, but left its secret documents out when they discovered that another locked room contained nothing but rice bowls. However, a battalion of Japanese translators continued to work because of the enormous haul. It contained copies of the order to attack Pearl Harbor, which served as the foundation for the prosecution during the Tokyo war crimes trials. The Manual for Japanese Destroyer Anti-Submarine Warfare, the Combined Fleet Command's orders on fleet tactical doctrine, charts of mined waters, lessons learned reports on past battles, extensive copies of Japanese Navy fleet operations, orders and plans from Pearl Harbor to Leyte, the cruiser's radar set, the Japanese Navy's regulations, standing orders, and doctrine for Japanese carrier units, and even samples of Japanese infrared and ultraviolet signal lamps that were unknown to American intelligence were also brought up. Had the United States been forced to invade Japan, the intelligence would have been crucial for dealing with the Japanese Navy during the attack, even though it was obtained relatively late in the war, after the majority of the Imperial Navy had been destroyed, and before the atomic bombs. They were helpful to historians as things progressed. If Mogami hadn't hit Nachi in the Surigao Strait that morning, Nachi wouldn't have had to turn around and head to Manila Bay for repairs, where Halsey's planes would have intercepted him. Thus, Mogami was surrounded by yet another significant millstone as a result of the American intelligence coup. An even greater failure had marked the conclusion of her failed career. Vice Admiral Shima's flag, which hung from her masthead right before the disaster was dynamited as a barrier to safe navigation, was also freed from Nachi's hull. Since Nachi's death was a direct result of the collision with Mogami, it was the sole instance of an enemy admiral's flag being removed from a warship at sea during World War II. And it added one more humiliation to Mogami's already dismal career. Author David Lipman, who lives in New Jersey, frequently contributes to WW2 history. Among the many subjects he has written about are several Pacific War battles,